The day Anna Harper rode into Cold Creek, New Mexico territory, with nothing but a carpetbag, a crate of books, and a letter of appointment from the Territorial Board of Education, Amos Ford was up on a ladder fixing a loose shutter on the general store, and he nearly fell off when he saw her. It was the spring of 1878, and Cold Creek was the kind of town that swallowed people whole or spat them out before the first frost came. It sat in a shallow valley between two rust-colored mesas, with a main street barely wide enough for two wagons to pass without losing paint, and a population of roughly 200 souls who had mostly come west chasing something they couldn't quite name. There was a saloon that doubled as the post office on Tuesdays, a livery stable that smelled of hay and horse and something older than memory, a church that hadn't had a proper preacher in 8 months, and as of that morning, a schoolhouse that had a new teacher. Anna Harper was 24 years old. She had come from St. Louis, where she had been teaching at a small school near the river until the funding dried up and the board closed it without ceremony. She had answered the territorial advertisement on a Thursday and received confirmation on a Monday, and she had not let herself think too hard about what she was riding into, because if she had thought too hard about it, she would have stayed in St. Louis and taken a position as a seamstress, which she had been offered and which would have made her very comfortable and very miserable. She was not a woman who chose miserable comfort. That was the first thing anyone in Cold Creek would have learned about her, had they thought to ask. Amos Ford watched her climb down from the stagecoach with the kind of practiced dignity that people develop when they know they are being watched and have decided not to care. She wore a dark traveling dress with dust on the hem, and her dark brown hair was pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that was slightly too large for her head and kept threatening to slide forward. She caught it with one hand, tucked the carpetbag under her arm, and looked up and down the street with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who was not easily impressed but who was genuinely curious. Amos climbed down from the ladder. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean, with hands that were permanently stained along the knuckles from working with horses and fence posts and the particular red clay of the valley floor. He had grown up 40 miles east of Cold Creek on his father's ranch and had taken a small piece of land near the creek 2 years prior, building a house by himself over the course of a summer, which was the kind of thing men did out here when they had no one to do it with them and no particular inclination to ask for help. He was not a man of many words. The people of Cold Creek would have told you that freely. Amos Ford could go a full day working alongside a man and say only what was strictly necessary, and yet no one ever called him cold, because there was something about his manner, something in the steadiness of his attention when he listened, that made a person feel fully heard. He had dark eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same rock as the mesas, and when he did speak, he meant every syllable. He watched Anna Harper pay the stage driver, survey her crate of books with some concern, and then march directly into the general store as though she had been coming here her entire life. He followed her in, which was not something he had planned to do. The general store was run by Margaret Tully, a woman of 50-something who had outlasted 2 husbands and a drought, and who greeted strangers with the same blunt appraisal she gave cattle at market. She was behind the counter when Anna entered, and she looked the younger woman up and down once and said, "You'll be the new teacher." "Anna Harper," Anna said, extending her hand across the counter. "I was told there would be lodging arranged through the school board." Margaret shook her hand with the firmness of someone who did not distinguish between men and women when it came to handshakes. "There's a room above the schoolhouse. It's dry mostly. There's a stove, but the flue needs checking before you use it." She paused. "You brought books." "I brought 2 crates. One is still on the stage." Margaret looked at her for a long moment with something that might have been respect working its way up through the skepticism. "Most folks out here don't put much stock in books." "Most folks out here could probably use a few more," Anna said, pleasantly but without apology. That was when Amos walked in, hat in hand, dust on his boots, and Margaret said, without looking up from the ledger she had returned to, "Amos, this is Miss Harper. She's teaching at the schoolhouse." Amos looked at Anna Harper. Anna looked at Amos Ford. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which was unusual for Anna, who generally had something to say, and not at all unusual for Amos, who generally did not. "I saw you coming off the stage," he said finally. "Your other crate. I can carry it for you." It was possibly the least poetic introduction in the history of human courtship. And yet something about the directness of it, the simple, practical offering of it, made Anna tuck a smile into the corner of her mouth. "That would be very kind," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Ford, Amos Ford. Thank you, Mr. Ford." He carried the crate to the schoolhouse without complaint, though it weighed a considerable amount and the schoolhouse was at the far end of the street. She walked alongside him and he found, to his mild alarm, that the silence between them was not uncomfortable but was instead the kind of silence that had weight and shape, the kind that suggested something might eventually be said inside it. "Have you been in Cold Creek long?" she asked, as they passed the livery stable. "2 years this summer. Do you like it?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "Yes," he said. "There's good land here. Good water, which is more than most places in the territory can say." "I read about the water before I came," she said. "I read about most things before I came." He looked at her sideways. "How many books did you bring?" 47, she said, and there was something so matter-of-fact about it, so completely unapologetic, that he nearly stopped walking. 47 books, he repeated. "Is that strange to you?" "I've read maybe a dozen books my whole life," he said. "Which ones?" He thought about it. "The Bible, a farming almanac, 2 dime novels I'm not proud of, and a book about horses someone left at the ranch where I worked when I was young. What was the horse book called?" "I don't remember, but it had good drawings." She laughed, and it was a warm, unguarded laugh, the kind that came without warning, and Amos Ford felt something shift very slightly in his chest, the way a fence post shifts when the ground beneath it is less solid than it appeared. He set the crate down inside the schoolhouse door, looked around at the single room with its rough-hewn benches and the blackboard that was more gray than black from years of chalk dust and incomplete erasure, and said nothing, because he was not a man who remarked on things that couldn't be easily changed. Anna looked around the same room and said, "It has good light." He looked again. She was right. The windows faced east and west, and the afternoon sun was coming through the west-facing ones in long, warm columns that lit the chalk dust in the air so that it looked like snow falling sideways. He had passed this building 100 times and never thought about the light. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, meaning nothing specific by it, just that he would come back the way a person does when they are in the habit of going places. "All right," she said, and went back to opening her crate, and he left, and stood outside in the street for a moment with his hat in his hands before he put it back on and walked to the livery to collect his horse. He rode home that evening in the long golden light of the New Mexico spring, and did not allow himself to think about Anna Harper with any particular intensity, which was how he knew he was already thinking about her quite intently. The schoolhouse opened its doors to students the following Monday, and by the end of the first week, Cold Creek had opinions about the new teacher. The children adored her with the ferocity that children reserve for adults who treat them as though their thoughts are worth hearing. The parents were more complicated. Some of them, particularly the fathers who worked cattle and had never seen the point of prolonged education, were suspicious of a woman who had traveled so far alone. Some of the mothers, meanwhile, were quietly grateful that their daughters were being taught by someone who seemed to believe those daughters were worth educating. Amos came back the next day, as he had said he would. He had no real reason to be at the schoolhouse, but he brought a tool bag and checked the flue of the wood stove, which Margaret had said needed looking at, and then replaced 2 boards on the step that had been soft with rot. He did these things quietly while Anna was in the room organizing her books, and when she asked what she owed him, he said nothing, just picked up his tool bag and left. which she found both irritating and oddly touching. He came back the week after that with a can of whitewash and painted the interior walls of the schoolhouse on a Saturday while she was correcting compositions at her desk. And they talked, or rather she talked, and he listened, and occasionally said something short but precise that demonstrated he had been paying close attention. She told him about St. Louis, about the river and the noise of the city, about the school that closed and the seamstress position she did not take. He told her about growing up east of town, about his father's cattle operation, about the land he had bought near the creek and the house he had built. "You built it yourself," she said. "Mostly. Caleb Moore helped me raise the roof." "What does it look like?" He thought about this with the same seriousness he brought to most questions. "It's a single story, 2 rooms inside, one bigger than the other. There's a porch on the east side, and a good stove, and a bookshelf." "1 bookshelf," she said with a certain kind of loaded lightness. "It's a good one," he said, a little defensively, which made her smile. She would find out later that it was, in fact, a very good bookshelf. But that would come later. The weeks passed with the particular rhythm of a frontier spring, which is to say that they were full of work and weather, and the ongoing business of a small town trying to stay alive. The grasslands around Cold Creek were greening after a dry winter, and the ranchers were moving cattle and repairing fences, and doing all the things that needed doing before the summer heat arrived and made everything twice as hard. Amos was busy from before sunrise until after dark most days, working his small herd and the contracted work he did for other ranchers to supplement his income. But he found time, consistently, to come by the schoolhouse. It was never anything dramatic. He would appear on a Saturday with a new length of rope for the bell pull that had snapped. He would come by after supper on a Tuesday with a jar of honey from a family up the valley who kept bees and had given him a portion in exchange for help mending their barn. He would stop by on his way back from town with a piece of information she might need, the location of the nearest doctor, which was 3 hours' ride east, the name of the man who sold firewood in winter, the best way to handle the creek road when it flooded in summer. He told himself he was being a good neighbor. He told himself this with significant conviction. Anna, for her part, was not a fool. She was a woman who had read 47 books and who paid attention to patterns. She noticed that his visits were regular and purposeful, and that he always had a reason, but that the reason was never the real reason, in the way that a person who comes to return a borrowed pen and then stays for 2 hours discussing the nature of memory and landscape has not really come about the pen. She also noticed that he never stayed too long, never pushed, never said anything that could be called forward. He was careful in a way that was almost painful to watch, the way a person is careful with something that matters very much to them. She found it equally frustrating and endearing, mostly endearing. By the time the summer heat arrived in force, they had developed a rhythm. Saturday mornings she would find him at the schoolhouse for some reason or another, and they would end up sitting on the east-facing step in the shade of the porch overhang. And she would read aloud from whatever she was currently working through, and he would listen with his hat resting on his knee and his eyes on the middle distance. He had told her once on one of those early mornings that he liked being read to more than he liked reading himself, because when he read he was always aware of the words on the page, but when she read to him, he just had the story. She had looked at him after he said that, and he had seemed almost embarrassed by it, as though he had said more than he meant to. "That's a beautiful thing to say," she told him. "It's just the truth," he said, and looked away at the mesas. She read to him over those summer months from a novel by George Eliot, from a collection of essays by Frederick Douglass that she had brought specifically, because she believed the children of Cold Creek should understand the world they lived in more fully, and from a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that had made the crossing from St. Louis slightly battered at the spine but still legible. She also, over those months, told him things she had not intended to tell anyone in Cold Creek, about her mother, who had died when Anna was 16, about her father, who had remarried a woman who was not unkind, but who had made it very clear that Anna's continued education was a financial strain, about the teacher in St. Louis, an older woman named Mrs. Crane, who had taken Anna under her wing and taught her that a classroom was one of the few places in the world where the usual hierarchies could be temporarily suspended if the teacher was willing to enforce a different kind of order. Amos listened to all of it. He did not offer unsolicited opinions. He asked questions that were quiet and careful, and showed he had been tracking the whole conversation, not just waiting for a moment to respond. In return, she learned about him. She learned that he had been 17 when his father died of a fever, and that he had run the ranch for 2 years with his younger brother Marcus, before the bank took it over a debt his father had not told either of them about. She learned that Marcus had gone to Texas after that, and that they wrote letters twice a year, which Amos read carefully and answered once in his slow, deliberate hand. She learned that he had a particular feeling for horses that went beyond the practical, that he talked to them when he thought no one was listening, that the horse he rode, a gray mare named Patience, had been with him since before the ranch was lost, and was the one creature in the world he could be said to be uncomplicated about. She asked to meet Patience one afternoon in late July, and he brought the mare around to the schoolhouse with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. And Anna fed the mare a bit of dried apple from her palm and said, "She has a good face." And Amos said, "Yes," and looked at Anna in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the horse. There was a dance in Cold Creek at the end of July, held in the open area behind the saloon, which was the largest cleared space in town. It was a regular summer tradition, and nearly everyone came, including the families from the ranches outside town who rarely came in except for supplies and the occasional emergency. There was a fiddle and a banjo and a man who played harmonica better than any harmonica had ever been played in that particular valley. Amos had not gone to the dance the previous year. He had told himself it was because he had cattle to check, and that was true, but not entirely true. This year he went. He arrived late, which was not unusual for him, and stood for a while at the edge of the gathering with a tin cup of something that was vaguely described as punch and watched the dancers. He found Anna immediately, because he always found her immediately in any space, a fact he was not ready to examine too closely. She was dancing with Tom Whitfield, who ran the livery stable and was a decent man, and she was laughing at something he had said. Amos held his tin cup and watched and did not go over, because going over would have required a level of declaration he had not yet managed to make even to himself. But then the fiddle changed to a slower tune, and Tom Whitfield, who was married with 3 children and had simply been being friendly, excused himself, and Anna was standing at the edge of the dancing area looking out at the crowd. She saw Amos. She lifted her hand and waved once, a small, uncomplicated wave, and he crossed the space between them without deciding to. "You came," she said. "I said I might," he said, which was true. He had mentioned it with careful vagueness the previous Saturday. "Do you dance, Mr. Ford?" He had asked her in May to call him Amos, and she had agreed to, but she kept slipping back to the formality when she was in a mood to tease him, and he had started to recognize the distinction. "I've been known to," he said. "Well," she said, and held out her hand. He took it. He was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him afterward, and he said he had learned at a ranch dance years ago from a Mexican vaquero, who had insisted that any man who could not dance was only half a man, which had been motivating instruction. She laughed at this, and they were standing closer than they had been during the dance because the crowd had compressed around them. And for a moment she looked up at him with the lamp light from the lantern strung overhead turning everything the color of embers, and neither of them said anything. He stepped back. Not quickly or rudely, just back into the careful distance he maintained like a boundary stone he had placed himself. "I should check on Patience," he said. "I tied her near the edge of town." "Of course," she said smoothly, giving him the exit without comment. She watched him go and pressed her lips together in a way that Margaret Tully, who had been watching the whole evening from a fold-out chair near the punch table, recognized immediately. "That man," Margaret said to her, the following morning when Anna came in for sugar, "is going to be the death of his own chances if someone doesn't do something about it." "He's careful," Anna said, studying the sugar scoop. "He's terrified," Margaret said with the brisk accuracy of someone who had watched a lot of people be terrified of a lot of things. "Which is not the same, though in his case the two look similar." "I'm not going to chase him," Anna said. "I didn't say chase, I said someone should do something." Margaret weighed the sugar. "Though in this case I suppose that someone would have to be him." Anna said nothing, which Margaret took to mean she agreed but was too dignified to say so. Amos, meanwhile, was doing something that he could not quite explain to anyone, including himself. He was building a bookshelf. He had gone back to his house the night of the dance and stood in his main room and looked at the bookshelf he had built when he moved in, which was a solid, well-made piece of furniture running the length of one wall. It held his almanac, a few tools manuals, a Bible, and a coffee tin that he used to store receipts. There was considerable empty space. He stood there for a while. Then he went to his woodpile, came back inside, and started measuring. He did not know, at this point, what he was building or why. Or rather, he knew, underneath the practical part of his mind that was measuring and planning. He simply would not let himself say it yet. He worked on the second bookshelf at night by lamplight, when his day's work was done. He was meticulous about it. He used oak boards that he had purchased from the lumber yard in the next town over, which required a day's ride, and which he told himself was just because the oak was better quality than the pine available locally. And this was true, but it was also true that he wanted it to be right. He used a hand plane to smooth the surfaces until they were glass fine. He cut the joints with precision. He measured the proportions carefully, making this shelf slightly taller and slightly deeper than the first one, making room for books that would be too large for the existing shelf, which was to say the kind of books a person accumulated when they had 47 of them to begin with and likely intended to acquire more. He was not thinking about this consciously, except that he was. September came, and with it the first sharp edges of fall in the morning air, the mesas turning from rust to a deeper, cooler burgundy as the light changed. The children were back at school in full attendance after the summer harvests were done, and Anna had settled into the schoolhouse with the particular authority of someone who had made a place their own. She had hung a map of the United States on one wall and a chart of the alphabet on another, and her books were organized on a shelf she had built from salvaged lumber, a simple thing that held most of them, with the overflow stacked carefully on the floor. Amos saw the overflow stack on a Saturday in September and said, with his eyes on the books, "That's not good for them. Books shouldn't be on the floor." "I know," she said, "but I haven't the materials for another shelf." He said nothing else about it. He said nothing else about it because his own second shelf was not yet finished. He was about 3 weeks from done, he estimated, with the final joinery and the finish work still to come. He went home that Saturday and worked until well past midnight. Anna Harper, during the months of September and October, was doing her own kind of reckoning. She had come to Cold Creek for the teaching position, and the teaching position was good, and the children were rewarding and the work was meaningful. She had told herself when she came that she was building a life here, a professional life, a life of purpose. She had not told herself, because she had been deliberately not telling herself certain things, that she was also, slowly and without planning it, building something else. She was building the habit of looking for Amos Ford. She noticed when he had not been by for more than a few days, not with alarm but with a low-grade awareness, the way you notice when a familiar sound has stopped. She noticed that when he was there she was more comfortable in her own skin than she was at other times. She noticed that she saved things for him, passages she had read, thoughts she had had during the week, small events in the school that had surprised or pleased her. She noticed all of this, and then she went back to correcting compositions and laying the fire and teaching the 17 children of Cold Creek, New Mexico Territory, how to read and write and reckon and think. But she noticed. There was a man in October who came to town and changed things somewhat. His name was Richard Carver, and he was a lawyer from Santa Fe who had come to Cold Creek on some business related to a land dispute between two of the larger ranches. He was 30 years old and handsome in a polished way, and he had been to law school in the East and had read more books than the average man in the territory, which he was happy to tell you about. He came into the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon, introduced himself with considerable charm, and stayed to talk about books for an hour and a half. He came back the following Wednesday. He asked Anna to join him for supper at the boarding house the Saturday after that. Anna went because she was a grown woman who could decide for herself what she did with her Saturdays, and because part of her, if she was honest, wanted to see what happened inside herself when she spent time with a man who was overtly, declaratively interested in her. What happened was that she had a pleasant evening with a man she found agreeable but not arresting. Richard Carver was interesting to talk to. He had opinions and information. He asked her questions about herself that were designed, she noticed, more to demonstrate his own breadth of interest than to actually hear her answers, because when she answered he nodded in a way that was already moving toward his next thought. Amos, when he actually listened, went still. Richard Carver, when he listened, was already composing his response. She came home from that supper, climbed the stairs to her room above the schoolhouse, and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands and felt the shape of something she had been deliberately not naming. She named it. She was in love with Amos Ford. She sat with this for a while, turning it over the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. She was in love with him in a way that had grown so gradually that she had not caught it happening, the way a tree grows, not through any single moment of growth, but through the accumulated work of days and seasons. She was in love with his quietness and his precision, and the way he carried himself through the world with a steadiness that was not rigidity, but was instead something more like a deep root. She was in love with the way he talked about his land and his horse. She was in love with the look on his face when she read to him. She was also, she acknowledged, going to have to be patient because Amos Ford was not a man who moved quickly on things that mattered to him. He was slow and deliberate and careful in direct proportion to how much something meant to him. The more it mattered, the more careful he became. She understood this. It was not always comfortable to understand it, but she understood it. She declined Richard Carver's second invitation to supper, kindly and without extensive explanation, and he left Cold Creek the following week having resolved his land dispute and apparently harboring no lasting damage to his ego, which was resilient in the way lawyers' egos tend to be. October wore into November and the nights turned genuinely cold and the cottonwoods along the creek went from gold to bare in the space of a week, and Amos finished the second bookshelf. He stood in his main room and looked at it for a long time. It was, by any measure, an excellent piece of furniture. The oak had taken the finish beautifully, a simple linseed oil treatment that brought out the grain and left the wood looking warm and alive. The proportions were right. The joints were tight. It was taller than the first shelf and deeper, with 5 full shelves that could hold a serious collection of books, the kind a person might accumulate over years of reading, or might arrive within 2 crates on a stagecoach. He stood there looking at it, and the thing he had been not saying to himself for 3 months made a sound like a door opening. He had built the shelf for Anna Harper. He had built it because the overflow stack on the schoolhouse floor had bothered him, yes, but not for the reason he had told himself. He had built it because he wanted her to have a place for her books, in his house. Her books in his house on his shelves, mixed in with the almanac and the Bible and whatever else accumulated over a life shared between 2 people. That was what he had been building, not a bookshelf, a question. He spent the better part of November working himself up to asking it, which was to say he spent November doing all the usual things, working his cattle, mending his fences, riding to town for supplies, visiting the schoolhouse on Saturdays. And while doing all of these things, he was also, in the part of his mind that ran quieter and deeper than the practical surface, rehearsing a conversation he could not quite make himself have. He had kissed exactly one woman in his life before now, and that had been 5 years ago and brief and uncomplicated, and nothing like what he felt in the general vicinity of Anna Harper, which made the gap between what he felt and what he was capable of saying feel approximately the size of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Anna, who was patient but not infinitely so, noticed something different about him in November. He was more restless on their Saturday mornings. He would stand and then sit. He would start a sentence and not finish it. He looked at her sometimes with an expression that she could not read through, which was unusual because she had become fairly fluent in Amos Ford's silences. But this one was new, denser, more interior. She gave him space, and then she gave him more space, and then one Saturday morning in late November when the cold had made the air in the schoolhouse sharp and bright and she had stoked the stove and they were both sitting on the step with mugs of coffee, warming their hands, she said, "Amos." "Yes," he said. "You've been working up to something for weeks," she said. "Whatever it is, I'd rather you just said it." He looked at her. She looked at him. The creek behind the schoolhouse was running low and clear and they could hear it in the silence between them. "I built something," he said. "What did you build?" He took a breath. "A bookshelf," she blinked. "A bookshelf. In my house." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "It's a good one, oak, 5 shelves, wider than the one I already have. It could hold considerably more than 47 books." He paused. "Considerably more." Anna Harper looked at this man, this careful, quiet, maddeningly deliberate man, who had just spent what she suspected were 3 months building a piece of furniture as a way of asking her a question he could not yet say in words, and she felt something warm and expansive move through her chest. "Why did you build a second bookshelf, Amos?" she said, keeping her voice very steady. He looked at the creek. "Because I was hoping," he said slowly, "that there might come a time when you needed somewhere to put them. Your books here in Cold Creek, somewhere that wasn't the schoolhouse." He stopped. She waited. "Somewhere that was permanent," he said, "if you were going to stay." "And if I weren't going to stay?" He looked at her then directly, and the thing that was usually behind his eyes in the careful, contained space where he kept the things that mattered most to him was suddenly visible. "That," he said, "is what I've been trying to figure out how to ask about." "You've been trying to figure out how to ask whether I'm going to stay," she said. "I've been trying to figure out how to ask whether you might consider staying. Permanently. In a house with 2 bookshelves and a porch and a gray mare called Patience." He cleared his throat. "With me, I have been trying to figure out how to ask you that." Anna set her coffee mug down on the step beside her. She turned to face him fully. "Amos Ford," she said, "did you just spend 3 months building a bookshelf because you did not have the nerve to simply ask me to stay?" A pause. "Yes," he said, and there was something almost comic in the plainness of it, in the absolute honest simplicity of his admission, and she would have laughed except that she was suddenly and completely overwhelmed by the tenderness of it, by the 3 months of quiet, careful, devoted effort that it represented. All that work and all that feeling, expressed in oak and fitted joints and 5 smooth shelves, because words were hard and building things was what he knew. "Well," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady in a way she decided she did not mind, "I would like to see this bookshelf." He looked at her. "Now, if you're willing to show me." They rode out to his land in the late morning, with the sun thin and winter pale over the mesas. His property was 1.5 miles west of town, set back from the creek behind a stand of cottonwoods that were bare now but would be green again by spring. The house was exactly as he had described it. A single story, solid and neat, with a porch on the east side and a good chimney and the practical, unornamented look of something built by a person who cared about function and durability more than appearance but who had still, she noticed, taken care with the details. The porch boards were level and smooth. The windows were properly fitted in their frames. There was a boot scraper by the front door that someone had made from a twisted iron horseshoe, simple and clever. Inside, the house was clean and spare. A main room with the stove and a table and 2 chairs and the original bookshelf, which was indeed a good one, running along the wall beside the window. The second room had a bed and a chest and hooks on the wall for gear, and there on the opposite wall of the main room from the first shelf was the second bookshelf. Anna crossed to it. She ran her hand along the top shelf, feeling the smooth finish, the careful fit of the wood. She pressed the back of one shelf to test its stability. It did not move. She looked along the length of it, the way you sight along a board to check its straightness, and it was true and square and absolutely solid. She stood there with her hand on the shelf for a long moment. "It's beautiful," she said. He was standing a few feet behind her, and she could feel the quality of his attention in a way she had become accustomed to, that particular focused stillness. "Anna," he said. She turned around. He was not a man who made speeches, and he did not make one now. But he had clearly, over those 3 months, been working on something beyond the woodwork, because he said, carefully and clearly, "I know I'm slow about things that matter. I know I took a long time getting here. But I have been building up to this the best way I know how, and the best way I know how turned out to be that." He gestured at the shelf. "What I mean to say is that I would like you to stay in Cold Creek. I would like, if you're willing, for us to have a proper understanding. I would like to court you, and I would like, if in time you were agreeable, for this to be your house as well as mine. That's what I mean to say." He stopped. He looked at her with those dark, creekwater eyes and waited. Anna Harper had read 47 books, and she had thought about a great many things in a great many ways, and she could not, in this moment, think of a single word that was better than the one she already had. "Yes," she said. He blinked. Yes to all of it," she said. "The understanding, the courtship, the house." She looked at the bookshelf. The shelf. The tension in his body released in a way she could see even from where she was standing. A slow exhale. A settling of the shoulders, as though he had been holding something braced against a possibility of falling for a very long time, and could now put it down. He crossed the space between them in 3 steps and took her hand in both of his and held it. Just held it, with the same care and precision he had brought to every piece of work she had ever seen him do. And she looked up at him in the winter light coming through the west window, and thought that she would remember this room exactly as it was. The pale light, the smell of wood and lamp oil and cold air coming through the door they had left slightly open. The 2 bookshelves on opposite wall, like a conversation completed. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, briefly and with a gravity that made her breath catch, and then looked at her and said, with the first real smile she had ever seen from him that was completely unguarded, "I'll take you back to town before the light goes." "I know you will," she said. They courted through the winter with a decorum that satisfied the more traditional elements of Cold Creek society, which was to say that they were seen together in public, and their interactions were proper by the standards of 1878, and yet no one who watched them together for more than 10 minutes was under any illusion about the nature of what was happening. They had Sunday dinners at Margaret Tully's boarding house, which Margaret had begun hosting as a semi-regular social event for the town, and which provided a respectable context for their company. They took walks along the creek road in the brief warmth of the winter afternoons. He brought her firewood for the schoolhouse stove without being asked and never made a ceremony of it. And on the Saturday mornings, she brought her books to his house. Not all at once, not permanently, not yet. But a few at a time on each Saturday visit, and she arranged them on the new shelf while he watched from the table with his coffee, and neither of them talked about what this was, which was a rehearsal for something larger, a practice run of the life that was in the process of becoming actual. She brought the George Eliot first, which seemed appropriate. Then the Whitman and the Douglas essays. Then a collection of natural history texts she had found in a second-hand catalog and ordered before she left St. Louis, which arrived in late January via the Territorial Post, battered and beautiful. He read parts of the natural history texts. He did not tell her he was doing this, but she noticed the books moved slightly between visits, the way books do when they have been taken down and replaced. She asked him, one Saturday in February, what he had thought of the section on plains ecology. He said he had found it interesting, but that the author had clearly never been west of the Mississippi, because some of the observations about grass types were wrong. She asked him how he knew. He said he had watched grass for most of his life, which was not as strange as it sounded. She said she did not think it was strange at all. They were, in the way that two people who have decided to love each other with full attention become, increasingly known to each other. Not in a way that removed the mystery, which she had found in some of her reading, was a fear people had about intimacy, but in a way that deepened it. The more she knew about him, the more she understood how much she did not yet know, and this felt not like a deficit but like the particular richness of something that would go on being interesting for a long time. He proposed to her in March, on a Saturday morning, on the step of the schoolhouse where so many of their Saturdays had begun, with the spring returning to the valley and the cottonwoods starting to show the first green at the tips of their branches. He did not have a ring yet. He would tell her this directly, because he had thought about pretending to have one, and then decided that pretending was not something he was good at, and was probably not a strong foundation for a proposal. He said, "I've been thinking about what to ask you, and I've been thinking about how to ask it, and I find I've come back to the same place every time, which is that I would like you to be my wife. I would like us to build something here together. I believe we would be good at it. And I believe, if I'm reading things right, that you might agree." "You're reading things right," she said. "Good," he said. "Then I'd like to do this properly." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small piece of paper, folded in quarters, which he handed to her. She unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn picture, clearly done by someone who had technical ability but not formal artistic training, of a simple ring with a stone that was marked with a small annotation reading turquoise in his careful handwriting. She looked at the drawing for a moment, and then she looked at him. "I didn't want to choose it without you," he said. "I thought you'd want to choose it yourself. The drawing is so you'd know what I had in mind generally." Anna Harper, who had read 47 books and who did not generally cry at sentimental things, felt her eyes fill. She did not let the tears actually fall, because she was on the step of the schoolhouse in plain view of the main street and she had a professional reputation to maintain, but it was a near thing. "Yes," she said, as she had said the first time, because it was still the only word that was big enough and simple enough to hold what she meant. They were married in June, in the Cold Creek church that had by then acquired a new preacher, a young man from Kentucky who was earnest and a little overwhelmed by the territory, but who conducted a fine ceremony. Margaret Tully stood with Anna as her witness, and Caleb Moore, who had helped Amos raise the roof of his house 2 years earlier, stood with Amos. About half the town came, which in Cold Creek's terms meant the church was full, and there were people standing in the doorway and outside the windows. Anna wore a dress that she had ordered fabric for in April and sewn herself, because there was no dressmaker in Cold Creek, and the nearest one was too far to travel to for a single commission. It was a cream-colored cotton with small tucks at the bodice and a modest train, and she had embroidered the cuffs herself with small wildflowers in pale blue thread. Amos, when he saw her come down the aisle, stood very still in the way he became still when something mattered very much, and his eyes did not move from her face for the entire service. He had got the turquoise ring made by a silversmith in Santa Fe. It sat on her finger through the ceremony, catching the light from the church windows, and when the preacher announced they were married and Amos kissed her for the first time in front of everyone, it was brief and serious, and then he pulled back and looked at her with that same unguarded smile she had first seen in his winter house. And she thought she would spend a very long time being grateful she had gotten off that stagecoach with her carpetbag and her 47 books and her inconvenient refusal to choose comfortable misery. The reception was held in the churchyard and then gradually migrated to the saloon, as Cold Creek receptions tended to do, and the fiddle came out and the dancing started, and this time when it came to the slow tune, Amos did not excuse himself to check on Patience. They danced until the lamps burned low. She moved her books to his house the following week. All 47 of them, plus a small collection she had acquired over the winter from a catalog, which brought the total to 63. They filled the new shelf beautifully and left room for more, which had been, she understood now, entirely the point. Her almanac and her farming references went on the first shelf. Her novels and her essays and her poetry went on the second. It was a small arrangement, and it made sense, and it looked, she thought, standing in the main room of the house that was now her house, like a life. The schoolhouse continued to be hers, because the school board had offered a renewal of her appointment, and she had accepted it. And Amos, who had grown up understanding that the land belonged to people who worked it and that work took many forms, had never for a moment suggested otherwise. He was proud of her teaching in a way that he expressed through action rather than declaration, repairing the schoolhouse steps without being asked, building new benches for the classroom when enrollment grew, dropping by occasionally to haul water and never interrupting the lessons. The children adored him too, which had taken him somewhat by surprise. He was not, as he told Anna once with genuine puzzlement, a person who had ever known what to do with children. He had been 17 when his father died, and had gone straight into the adult business of survival without much intervening period. But the children of Cold Creek, emboldened by their teacher's obvious fondness for the quiet man who came to fix things at the schoolhouse, had decided that Mr. Ford was interesting, and they asked him questions about horses and cattle, and the mechanics of fences, with the relentless inquiry of children who had not yet learned to filter curiosity through politeness, and he answered them all with the same patient precision he brought to everything, and they left each conversation apparently satisfied. In the fall of 1879, the year after their marriage, Anna discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Amos on a Saturday morning in the kitchen of their house, with the autumn light coming through the window and a pot of coffee on the stove, and he sat down in his chair at the kitchen table as though his legs had made an executive decision and looked at her for a long moment and said, "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "Good," he said, and then he stood back up and came around the table and wrapped his arms around her with the careful, complete embrace of a man who understood the difference between holding something and holding it properly. And she leaned into him and felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and thought, yes. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, in the same house where Amos had built the second bookshelf, delivered by the local midwife, a formidable Mexican woman named Señora Fuentes, who had brought half the children of the valley into the world and who had strong opinions about ventilation and chamomile tea. The birth was long and frightening in the way that births are when you are acutely aware of what is at stake, and Amos spent 11 hours in the main room being quietly, thoroughly afraid, which was perhaps the most frightening experience of his adult life. When Señora Fuentes came out and told him he had a son and that Anna was tired but safe, he sat down on the bench beside the door and pressed his hands over his face for a moment, and then stood up and went in to see his wife, who was holding their boy with the particular exhausted, radiant expression that is one of the most ancient human looks there is. They named him Samuel, after no one in particular, but because it was a name that sounded like something that would last, which Amos thought was as good a reason as any for a name. Samuel Ford came into the world with a disposition very like his father's, quiet and observant and content with his own company, but with a capacity for sudden, enormous laughter that was entirely his mother's. He watched the world with dark eyes and grew steadily and surely, the way things do in good soil with enough water. Anna kept teaching. She took a brief confinement before the birth and returned to the schoolhouse 6 weeks after Samuel was born, bringing him with her for the first months, where he slept in a basket near her desk, and the older students took turns rocking him when he fussed, which he did with considerable restraint for an infant of his age. The years in Cold Creek settled into the deep rhythm of a life well lived. Not without difficulty, because no life in the New Mexico Territory in those years was without difficulty. There were drought seasons and hard winters, and the continuing tensions that ran through the territory between the cattle ranchers and the sheep ranchers, between the Anglo settlers and the Mexican families who had been in the valley for generations, between the legal structures of the territory and the older, more complex realities on the ground. Anna taught the children of all these families, as best she could, and she was aware always of the injustice of a world that gave some of her students more to start with than others, not because of what those students deserved, but because of which families they had been born into, and which language they spoke at home, and which part of the complicated mosaic of the West they belonged to. She was not naive enough to think that good teaching fixed this. But she taught anyway, and she tried to teach honestly, including in her curriculum the essays and the histories that the Territorial Education Board would not have included if they had thought to check. She got away with more than she might have because she was good at her work, and because the children were learning, and because Amos Ford, though not a man of political influence in any formal sense, was a man whose word was respected in Cold Creek, in the way that the word of a person is respected when everyone knows they always mean it. They had a second child in 1882, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived with considerably more efficiency than Samuel had, and who from her first weeks demonstrated an energy and a volubility that was unlike either of her parents, but which both of them found entirely delightful. Clara talked before she walked and walked before she was supposed to, and by the time she was 3 was following Patience around the yard, with a proprietary interest that the mare endured with remarkable patience. Amos built a cradle for each child, as he had built the bookshelf, with the same meticulous care and the same good materials, and the cradles were so well made that they were still solid and unmarked by the time Clara had grown out of hers. By the mid-1880s, the collection of books in the house on the creek had grown considerably beyond 63. They had acquired more shelves. The second bookshelf that Amos had built in the fall and winter of 1878 was now the middle of 3, and the original shelf had been joined by 2 more on the opposite wall, and books had begun to appear on a shelf in the bedroom and a smaller shelf in the kitchen, where Anna kept the cookbooks and the almanacs, and a volume of botanical illustrations she had acquired at some point, and which had gradually become one of Amos's favorite books, though he would not have said so unprompted. Samuel, at 6, had inherited his mother's reading habit and his father's taste for practical information, and read everything he could reach. Clara, at 4, preferred to have books read to her, and was insistent about this preference and specific about which books and in what order. Anna read to both of them every evening, as she had read to Amos in the beginning, and Amos listened from his chair by the stove, and the house was full of the particular warmth that books and lamp light and a stove going well can generate on a cold New Mexico evening. Amos would sometimes take over the reading mid-story, because Samuel would fall asleep and Clara would be fighting it but close, and Anna would be tired, and he would take the book and read on in his low, careful voice, stumbling occasionally over unfamiliar words but never skipping, always asking her quietly the next day if he had gotten the pronunciation right. She always told him. There were evenings, those evenings by the stove with the children drowsing and the lamp burning and the books ranged on their shelves, when Anna would look at Amos over the head of whichever child was wedged against his side, and he would look back at her with a look that said, very clearly and without any need for elaboration, that he knew exactly what they had, and that he had not taken a single day of it for granted. She felt the same. She felt it with a completeness and a clarity that only grew with time, which was not what she had expected of love, having read about it extensively in novels where it tended to peak at the moment of declaration, and then level off into comfortable domesticity. What she found, instead, was that love of the kind she and Amos had was less a peak than a plane, a wide, enduring place that you walked through together, and that kept showing you new features of its landscape the further you went into it. In 1886, something happened that briefly disturbed the quiet of their life. A land speculator from Colorado arrived in Cold Creek with documents claiming ownership of a portion of land that included the eastern boundary of Amos's property, a portion that included the water access to the creek that the house depended on. The documents were of questionable provenance, and the claim was almost certainly fraudulent, but disputing it required a lawyer and a trip to the territorial court in Santa Fe. Amos spent 3 weeks handling this with the same contained determination he brought to everything, riding to Santa Fe twice, working with a lawyer there to establish the original survey records, which proved the speculator's documents were indeed falsified. The speculator, faced with this evidence and the clear-eyed testimony of several neighbors who had watched Amos work that land for nearly a decade, withdrew his claim. Amos came home from the final Santa Fe trip on a Thursday evening, rode Patience into the yard, unsaddled her in the dark, and came inside to find Anna at the kitchen table waiting up for him with coffee and the remains of a supper she had kept warm. "It's done," he said, sitting down across from her. "He's gone." "Good," she said, and poured his coffee. He sat for a moment looking at his hands, and then he looked at her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to lose this place. And I find that what I kept coming back to was not the land which matters or the water which matters more, but that this is where you are. This is where your books are. This is where the children sleep." She looked at him. He had a habit still, after all their years, of saying the thing that turned out to be exactly the right thing and saying it as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It's our home," she said simply. "Yes," he said. "I wanted you to know that's what it is to me, not just land." "Our home, I know," she said. He drank his coffee and she sat with him in the warm kitchen, and outside the night over the mesas was immense and star-filled, and the creek ran in the darkness with that small, constant sound that she had come to think of as the voice of the place itself, steady and unhurried and always there. In 1888, the Territorial School Board offered Anna a position as a district supervisor, overseeing the schools in 4 communities in their valley region. It would mean less direct teaching and more administration and travel. She sat with this offer for 2 weeks before she brought it to the kitchen table, which was where they had always settled significant things. She told Amos about the offer in its full detail, and he listened completely and said nothing until she was done. "Do you want it?" he asked. "I think I might," she said. "I think the schools in the other communities need the kind of attention I've been giving this one." "Then you should take it," he said. "There would be travel, some overnight trips." "I know, I'll manage. Samuel could help with the morning feeding." "Samuel can already do the morning feeding better than some grown men I know," Amos said, which was true. Samuel, at 8, had his father's feel for animals and had been doing real work around the property for 2 years. "And Clara," she said. "Clara," Amos said, with a dry affection that was entirely his own, "has her own opinions about how everything should be done and is generally in the process of acting on them at all times. She'll be fine." Anna laughed. "She will be. She's rather like someone I know." He looked at her. "She's like you," he said, and he said it with such simple, uncomplicated pride that she felt it like a physical warmth. She took the position. She was a good supervisor, as she had been a good teacher, because her particular combination of high expectations and genuine care for the people she worked with translated from the classroom to the district level without much difficulty. She kept her classroom in Cold Creek as well, handing off the primary duties to a young teacher she supervised and mentored, a recent arrival from the East, a girl of 20 named Helen who reminded Anna powerfully of herself at that age, and who responded to supervision the way Anna had responded to Mrs. Crane in St. Louis, with a kind of grateful intensity. Helen boarded with Margaret Tully, and Margaret, now in her 60s and somewhat slowed by her joints but undiminished in her directness, took a proprietary interest in the younger teacher, and was heard to say that the school was in good hands and that Cold Creek had been lucky in its teachers. This was a thing that, when it got back to Anna, made her feel a satisfaction that was warm and deep and real. The year 1890 came, and Samuel Ford turned 10 years old, and Clara turned 8, and Amos turned 40, and Anna turned 36, and Cold Creek had grown somewhat from the town she had arrived in on that spring stagecoach, with a proper doctor's office now, and a second general store, and a community meeting hall that had been built on the effort of about 40 people on a single October weekend. The railroad had come as far as the next town east, and had changed the economics of the territory in ways both significant and small. Amos had expanded his cattle operation modestly over the years, always within what the land could sustain, which was a principle he held with the same steadiness he held most things. He was known in the valley as a fair man and a straight dealer, someone whose handshake meant the same as a document, and the younger ranchers in the area came to him with questions about grazing and water management, and the particular challenges of keeping cattle healthy through the dry summers. He was, without having pursued it or particularly wanted it, a figure of some local authority, which he wore with the same undemonstratively as he wore everything else. He was also still, on most Saturdays, to be found at the schoolhouse if something needed fixing. On an October Saturday in 1890, Anna came home from an overnight supervisory visit to the school in the neighboring community to find her husband and her 2 children sitting on the east-facing porch in the cool afternoon, all 3 of them with books open in their laps. Samuel had his father's almanac, because he had developed a serious interest in weather patterns that summer. Clara had a novel that was slightly above her reading level that she was working through by sheer force of will and vocabulary determination. And Amos had the battered Botanical Illustrations book, which had migrated permanently to his regular reading rotation without any fanfare. She stood at the yard gate for a moment and looked at this picture: her husband, her son, her daughter, her porch, her house, with its 2 original bookshelves and the additional shelves that had accrued over 12 years of shared reading, the creek audible in the cottonwoods, the mesas in the afternoon light, rust and burgundy, and the particular golden wash that came in October when the angle of the sun changed. Amos looked up from his book. He had the ability always to know when she was nearby, which she had teased him about over the years and which he had never been able to fully explain. "You're back," he said. "I'm back," she said. She came through the gate and up the steps, and he moved slightly on the porch bench to make room, which was unnecessary as there was another chair right there. But she sat beside him on the bench anyway, and he shifted his book to one hand and put his other arm around her shoulders, and Clara immediately abandoned her own book to lean against her mother's other side. And Samuel, who was at the age where displays of family affection were being processed through a complex internal calculation, looked up from his almanac, decided that this particular moment was acceptable, and went back to reading. Anna rested her head against Amos's shoulder and looked out at the valley in the October light and felt the specific, indelible contentment of a person who has arrived, completely and without reservation, exactly where they are supposed to be. "How was it?" Amos asked. "Good. The teacher in Millstone Creek is doing well. She's settled in. I think she'll stay." "Like you stayed," he said. She tilted her head up to look at him. "Like me, though I had more enticement." "The bookshelf," he said. "The bookshelf," she agreed. "And the man who built it," he said, with no particular emphasis, just placing the fact where it belonged in the sentence. "Especially him," she said. He tightened his arm slightly around her shoulders and looked back out at the valley, and she could feel the quiet satisfaction in him, the same steady, undemonstrative contentment that had characterized every good thing in their life together. Never showy, never excessive, always completely real. Over the following years, the house on the creek continued to be the particular kind of home that a place becomes when it is inhabited by people who love each other and work hard and pay attention to the world around them. Samuel, growing into his teens, showed the same aptitude for the land that his father had, and also an interest in engineering that no one had predicted, which manifested in a series of ambitious irrigation schemes he designed for the property and which actually worked, improving the water management on the east field considerably and prompting Amos to say, with a proud dryness, that his son had apparently been paying more attention to the farming almanacs than previously apparent. Clara, meanwhile, was a force of nature in the most direct possible sense. She had her mother's intelligence and her mother's passion, and as she entered her teens, demonstrated an aptitude for mathematics that was so pronounced that Anna arranged for her to have additional instruction from the district school in the county seat, which required a 3-hour ride twice a week, and which Clara undertook without complaint because the mathematics was worth it. She would go on, eventually, to the normal school in Santa Fe, following a path that her mother's early teaching had made imaginable, which was the thing about Anna Harper that Margaret Tully, old and slower now, but still occupying her chair behind the general store counter, said more than once. The woman made things imaginable. That was her particular gift. She made it possible for the children of Cold Creek to imagine lives they might not otherwise have imagined for themselves. This was not a small thing in 1878, and it was not a small thing in 1890, and it would not be a small thing in all the years that followed. In the spring of 1895, Amos turned 45 and Anna turned 41, and Samuel was 15 and Clara was 13, and they planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house in a spot Anna had been wanting to claim for a garden since their first spring, and it grew well, which she took as a sign. She told Amos about the sign on a Saturday morning on the east porch, with coffee, as she had been telling him things on Saturday mornings on the east porch for 17 years. "The beans are doing remarkably well," she said. "The soil there is good," he said. "Knew it would be. I should have started the garden earlier. You started it when you had time for it." "That's a generous interpretation." "It's the accurate one," he said, and looked at her sideways with the same look he had been giving her for 17 years, the one that was quiet and warm and direct, the one that meant I know you and I choose you, and these two things are not separate. She took his hand, which was as calloused and large and capable as it had ever been, and held it, and they sat in the spring morning light with the valley coming back to green, and the creek running full from the snowmelt up in the mountains, and the house behind them full of books and children and 17 years of a life built together, shelf by shelf and word by word and Saturday by Saturday. Later that morning, Samuel came out to the porch to ask his father about a fence repair he was planning, and Clara came out behind him with a notebook full of calculations she wanted her mother to look at, and the porch became briefly loud and full of questions and opinions, which was how it generally was when the whole family was in the same place. Amos answered the fence question. Anna looked at the calculations and made 2 suggestions, and said the rest was excellent work, which made Clara straighten slightly with the particular dignity of a person who has been recognized accurately. And then Samuel and Clara disappeared back into their various projects, and the porch went quiet again, and Anna and Amos sat in the easy silence that was theirs, that had always been theirs, that silence with weight and shape that she had noticed on their very first walk together down the main street of Cold Creek and had recognized even then as something worth staying for. "Amos," she said, after a while. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know," she said, looking out at the valley, "that this is everything I hoped for and more than I expected." He was quiet for a moment. "When you got off the stage," he said, "I was up on a ladder. I know, Margaret told me. I almost fell off it." She looked at him. "I didn't know that part. I'm telling you now," he said, "and if you had fallen off the ladder," he considered this, "I'd have gotten up," he said, "and I'd have still carried your crate." She laughed and he smiled, that full unguarded smile that had always felt like a rare and particular gift, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and they stayed like that while the morning passed around them, warm and full and perfectly ordinary, which was the very best kind of thing for a morning to be. The bookshelf he had built that winter in 1878, the one that had held all the things he could not yet say, stood in the main room of the house as it had stood for 17 years. The oak had darkened slightly with age and wear, taking on the color and texture of something fully settled into itself. Both shelves were full now, and the books on them were varied and loved and used, with cracked spines and penciled margins and the particular look of books that have been read more than once by more than one person. On the second shelf, the one he had built between a volume of essays and a natural history text, was a small piece of paper, folded in quarters, that had been there since the day Anna moved her books in and had placed it there herself, carefully, in the space between two spines. It was the drawing he had made of the turquoise ring. She had kept it all these years in the pocket of the dress she had worn that day in the schoolhouse, and when she moved her books she moved it too. He had noticed it on the shelf some time in that first year and had said nothing about it. She had noticed him noticing and had said nothing either. It was simply there, folded and small and permanent, the original question that had started everything, holding its place between the books. In the evenings, when the children were grown and gone to their various lives, Santa Fe for Clara and her mathematics, and later the family property and his own work for Samuel, and the house was quieter, Anna and Amos sat by the stove and read, sometimes aloud and sometimes separately, with the particular comfort of two people who have learned over many years how to be in the same room without requiring anything of each other beyond the simple fact of presence. She still read aloud to him sometimes. He still preferred it to reading alone, because when she read he could just have the story. He told her this still occasionally, and she still found it as beautiful as the first time he said it, on that early Saturday morning when they were just beginning, when everything ahead of them was still taking shape, still being built, like a house going up from the ground or a shelf being fitted joint by joint in the lamplight of a cold New Mexico winter. Outside, the valley held its peace. The creek ran on as it always had, steady and clear, which was more than most places in the territory could say, as he had told her that first day. The mesas stood in their ancient, rust-colored permanence, indifferent to history but beautiful within it. The cottonwoods along the water moved in the evening breeze, with a sound like turning pages. And inside, the books filled the shelves, all of them, from the George Eliot to the natural history text to the volumes that had come in afterward, year by year, building towards something they had built together, Anna Harper and Amos Ford, in a house on the creek in Cold Creek, New Mexico territory, where the water was good, and the light came through the west windows in long, warm columns, and where two bookshelves stood on opposite walls like a conversation that had been asked and answered, and would go on being answered for all the years still ahead.